Hello, class. This is going to be our lecture on elements and principles. As you can see here, we're going to be working with terms as well as showing you some article examples along the way. The purpose behind these kind of terms presentations is so that we can kind of start to build the language of artwork around our practice of drawing, so that when it comes time to start fleshing out our projects or start to kind of communicate what our intentions are behind our drawings, that we kind of have this language that we can kind of start to communicate as we progress through the semester. So our knowledge and our language is going to improve, and hopefully by the end of the semester, we'll be able to talk about artworks in the language of art, right? So what are elements and principles? Elements and principles are tools and techniques that are used in tandem to create dynamic and intentional compositions. So what I mean here is that an elements and principles are kind of working together in a composition, and then a lot of times an artist will have an intention moving into a project, and they will know which kind of elements and principles that they want to use, and a lot of times it kind of becomes second nature. So whether or not the artist is thinking about it in that moment, these things kind of tend to emerge either through intention or just through an artist's kind of natural tendencies to kind of work with them. We typically don't just jump straight into a drawing. There is some level of intention, some level of arrangement in a physical space before we move in, and that is the compositional portion of drawing, and then the composition then becomes the arrangement that we've created. Okay, so to bring it back to elements and principles, elements are the parts that define the visual, the tools and components that a person uses to create a composition. In other words, they represent the base of an artwork, right? So there is a difference and distinction between elements and principles. We'll get a little bit deeper into that as we move through the lecture, but just know that elements are different than principles, though they are related. So elements are going to be line, shape, form, texture, color, space, and value. Line can be defined as a point in motion. They have various different orientations. Some that you might be familiar with are vertical orientation, horizontal, or diagonal. They have a lot of different properties, such as being straight, curved, angular, bent, or thin. They have different line weights that can be thick, that can be thin, based on materiality that we're kind of working with. If we're working with like a ballpoint pen, or we're working with a brush, or we're working with a pencil, these lines can be hard, they can be blurred, soft. They might not even be present on the page at all, right? So in that case, we're dealing with implied lines. Lines can be used as a tool to define outlines or contours. They can also be used to define a space, and it could also be used as a tool of direction to kind of move the viewer's eye through a piece or an artwork or a composition. An artist that uses line very heavily in their work is Chae Won Moon. Chae Won Moon kind of pares down her imagery to this kind of I would say almost kind of like a user manual aesthetic. So here we are seeing like a very heavy use of these line drawings that are basically like just contour drawings, right? That are kind of playing off the strength of these kind of user manual aesthetics and this kind of essential image, right? If you think about the utility of a user manual, that's that it pares down kind of complex information into more essential, easy to read information, right? So paring all this information down to just line helps the viewer kind of move through the composition, but at the same time kind of follow it in almost like a step by step kind of informative way, right? So even though the information is maybe on the surface quick and easy to grasp, there's a kind of an invitation to move a little bit slower as we kind of look at a line drawing. And the reason for that is that, again, like I said before, the line is very much the structure of a drawing, right? When we're thinking about contours, they're the basis, the kind of skeleton that we're going to be using to build out our information later on. When we're talking about shape or form, we're talking about an enclosed space that's defined by other elements, such as line, color, value, or texture. Shape refers to a closed space made when a line connects within itself or to itself. Form refers to a shape that is or appears to be three-dimensional, having weight, width, and depth, right? So again, here we kind of start talking about real versus kind of implied form, right? Three-dimensional objects versus a three-dimensional drawn object. With Jonathan Lasker, we're dealing with shape again. He's using a lot of kind of overlapping lines, these kind of really dense marks to kind of create these blocks of shape. We can kind of see the interconnectedness here and how these lines kind of start to create this kind of amalgamation of lines that kind of create this form, but then also kind of start to create shapes within that larger shape. For Jaime Munoz, a lot of his work is kind of dealing with the illusion of form, right? The way we're kind of using this depth in space, this value shading to kind of create the illusion that these flat objects are three dimensional or have some sort of weight to them. So on the piece on the left, you can kind of see how these objects are kind of positioned in a space that is kind of created by this kind of interplay of color, shadow, and then also this kind of depth, right? This kind of classic way that we kind of interpret space as like an object in a box. Um, and the familiarity that we have with the form also, right? So the musculature on the horse, this kind of generator or this air compressor that we have down here at the bottom, these are all things that we can kind of start to perceive as having some kind of weight. With the piece on the right, we really are kind of approaching it from a lot of the similar kind of places that we were talking about the piece on the left, where we have a lot of color interplay, a lot of value kind of affecting the way we read the elements in this piece. This kind of gradation from dark to light in the background kind of creates this tunneling effect, which pulls us into the space. And then we have another bit of information, which is this text that's kind of laying down and almost kind of looking like it's being pulled into this tunnel. So there's a lot of visual information and a lot of relationships that are kind of an interplay throughout this composition that are kind of creating the illusion of these things having form and again being inside of this kind of space. In texture, we're talking about surface quality, and these surface qualities a lot of times can be real or they can be simulated or kind of fabricated textures, right? Simulated texture or like a felt texture, right? So in a simulated texture, we can kind of think about maybe like a photo of a rock face. We can think about a photo or drawing of like something that has some kind of texture that we're familiar with, a wood grain, things like that, versus something that's like an actual texture that exists in real life. So we can think about maybe like a metal sculpture, maybe that the artist was working with a very thick paint application, and it's a texture that we can see in real life, right, and that we can actually touch. Though a lot of times the artist would prefer if we didn't. And Shana McCoy's portrait series here that she works with, this is kind of that thick um, application of paint that we're talking about previously. This is kind of like an impasto style of painting where the paint is layered on very very thickly, and again there's kind of this contrast between this being like a two-dimensional image representation of a photograph, but then also having these kind of tactile elements of real space within it. So she kind of rides the line between this kind of simulated and then real textures. Color is the visible spectrum of reflected light. It has three attributes. Color has hue, which is its unique name, value, which is how light or dark it is, and then the intensity or saturation. A lot of times it's called purity or strength, and we kind of decrease the purity or strength of a color by adding white or black to it, in some instances gray. One of the primary tools that we use in assisting our selection of color is going to be the color wheel. And on this color wheel, colors are often organized in a way to where we can kind of see interrelationships within colors. Some of these relationships stem from our language of colors is pigments. So whenever we're talking about pigments and purity of pigments, primary colors are said to be colors that can't be mixed, that kind of exist in a most kind of pure state, right? So our primary colors are going to be red, blue, and yellow. Secondary colors are colors that emerge from the mixing of these primary colors. So yellow and red create orange, blue and yellow create green, and then red and blue create violet. Intermediary colors are what happens when we kind of take these primaries and secondaries and mix them together. So then we get tertiary colors such as red, orange, blue, green, etc. On the color wheel, colors that are next to one another are said to be in a color family or to be analogous. Colors that are opposite to one another are complementary colors. We also have an arrangement of cool and warm colors. Cool colors tend to recede while warm colors tend to move forward in the composition. So here in Jacqueline Valenzuela's piece, we can see how it's definitely kind of like an overload of colors. Again, when we're talking about the kind of experiences and associations that we have with color, here she's kind of alluding to maybe the scenery that she lives around in terms of like lowrider culture, and then this kind of graffiti, wall signage type of explosion of colors that exist around her in Los Angeles. Space is the area above, below, and within an artwork. It can be described in many different ways, including two-dimensional or three-dimensional. Within these kind of dimensions, we have flat space, shallow space, or deep space. Space can be open or closed. Positive space, which is kind of like the active area in a composition, or negative space, or areas that we kind of perceive to be either a background or kind of like a void in a composition. The illusion of space can be created using perspective, the way we kind of overlap shapes in the composition, as well as the relative scale that exists within objects or subjects in the composition, where large objects seem to come forward and then smaller objects seem to be further off in the distance. Greg Ito is an artist who uses space a lot in his compositions, and he uses value and shape in his benefit to kind of create the illusion of this space. If you guys can see the space on the left, again, is very kind of deep and inviting. The more we kind of explore it, the more we can see these deeper and deeper layers that we can kind of travel into. While the piece on the right is equally inviting, it kind of has this kind of flat window pane that kind of makes you feel like an outsider, right? So whereas the piece on the left is inviting, the piece on the right kind of is almost like in an enclosed space, right? The space is just beyond where we can reach, but it's still kind of pulling us into its depth. Light or dark that we see in an artwork, whenever we're thinking about value, especially when we're talking about drawing, we tend to think about it as shading, but there's a lot more that we can use value for. And typically whenever we're trying to assess value in the composition, we use a tool called a value scale, which is a tool that shows steps or gradations of lightness to darkness. So starting off with the clean white, moving into transitional grays, and ultimately leading to a nice rich dark black. We can use stark differences in value, like placing that black next to a white to create high contrast in an artwork and draw our viewers' attention to that area. Or we can use gradations to create a number of illusions like form, depth, or texture. In Sofia Ayademo's drawing, they achieve value through mark making, which is when we use kind of small strikes like hatching or cross hatching in a composition to kind of create a sense of density or openness. Typically, the denser our marks are, the darker an area is going to look, and the further apart our marks are, the lighter an area is going to look. Though she uses a full range of values in her drawings, we can see how she contrasts the values in her figures to create variety and keep the viewer's eye moving throughout the composition, moving from the foreground to the background and back again. Okay, now we're moving on to our principles. Principles are all about how an artist uses elements to create an artwork that conveys a message. If elements are going to be the building blocks, principles are how we arrange those blocks to create unique compositions. Principles include balance, emphasis, movement and rhythm, repetition and pattern, variety, and harmony. Balance is how we arrange visual elements to create a sense of stability or tension. One way to identify balance in a composition is by thinking about symmetry. Symmetry a lot of times can be broken down into top and bottom, left or right. These are kind of formal approaches to symmetry. Whenever we divide a composition in half and the elements on the left don't quite match the elements on the right, or the top doesn't quite match the bottom, we have what's called an asymmetrical composition. But a lot of times this asymmetry, if done intentionally, can help create balance in a composition. Radial symmetry is a little less common, but if you think about radial symmetry, it's kind of like having a central focus in the middle and then having elements kind of radiate out from it in a kind of patterned way that again still balances the composition. In looking at Carolyn Liu's work, there's a ton of active elements in these compositions that on the surface would make you think that this piece is definitely not balanced. But if we were to approach analyzing these pieces through the lens of symmetry, we can see that there's actually quite a bit of balance that's happening despite the amount of kind of chaotic information that we're seeing in the composition. If we're just focusing on the piece on the left here, for instance, if we were to draw a line down the middle, we'd see that the line of symmetry almost perfectly bisects the face, almost perfectly kind of bisects these arms. But if we break it down to more essential kind of treatments or more essential kind of elements that are existing on the left and the right, we see that a lot of these motifs start to repeat themselves, right? So if we were to draw a line straight down the middle here, we have a hand on the left, a hand on the right. The face is almost split down the middle. These framing elements that we have in the flowers are repeated left and right as well as top and bottom. Though initially it seems like there's a ton of active information, we do see balance in these compositions. Emphasis is the importance that we give to certain objects in the composition. It's where the artist wants your eye to go first. It's the center of attention. It's where your focus is meant to be. We can create emphasis through contrast and determine where we draw the viewer's eye. This contrast can be contrast of color, contrast of value, texture, shape, space, or line. Anytime we can kind of create something that's a little bit different, our eye is going to be drawn there. In these photographs by Joe Harjo, he utilizes a variety of techniques to draw our eyes to that kind of part that's created on his hair in the braiding process. In this composition, we can see contrast created between the light value of his scalp kind of showing through and the dark value of his hair. And we can also see contrast between the sharp focus that he placed on his head whenever he was taking this photo and the kind of softer focus that starts to fall on his shoulders and in the background. Movement and rhythm are principles that a lot of times exist in tandem but can exist separate from one another. Movement refers to how elements are arranged to draw your eye through an artwork or imply a sense of motion, whereas rhythm is a special kind of movement that utilizes repeated elements or components in a composition that kind of help the viewer's eye jump either rapidly or glide smoothly from one element to another. In Kari Turner's work, we can see movement activating these pieces in general, right? Where we can see a lot of very kind of heavy, energetic line activation and brushstroke activation. But within that movement, we can start to see different types of rhythms, right? Whereas the piece on the left has a very kind of high energy rhythm and these really tight zigzags that are kind of contained, and the piece on the right having this very large kind of sweeping brushstroke that's a little bit slower, but has a lot of the tension that we see in the contained work on the left kind of pouring out on the piece on the right. Repetition and pattern refer to elements that are repeated in a planned way to create rhythm or unity within a composition. In Sam Rodriguez's work, the repeated eagle motifs move with the feathers to help guide our eye to the left of the composition, while the pattern on the shirt moves us to the right. And although we have two different patterns in this work, they're unified by the figure in the middle, and we can kind of start to create a narrative around these kind of left pulls and right pulls. And despite the fact that these are two different patterns that are activating the composition, we can get the sense through this figure that they are part of a unified composition. In the piece on the right, we can see that the skull pattern is kind of functioning more of as a framing element or a border to kind of create variety or difference between the center panel and the composition. Variety is a principle in which we use art elements to create differences in an artwork and ultimately help create more visual interest through this kind of inspection of these differences. Graciela Samasier creates variety in her drawings through her use of color and different media. The differences between the graphite, colored pencil, marker, and ballpoint pen create a separation within the work that moves our eyes from the black and white elements in the composition to areas that she's activated with color. This ultimately makes the composition much more active and engaging, and it helps us pick up smaller and smaller details the longer we sit and kind of read the piece, right? We start to kind of see it in layers, we start to see the differences in activations, and ultimately the longer we can stay with the work, the more successful it is in keeping the viewer's attention and ultimately forming a connection with the work. Harmony is accentuating similarities within an artwork to help create unity. It's essentially the opposite of variety, and we try to focus on components that share common traits. In this piece by Moises Salazar, we can see how they allow separate materials to interact and mix to create a harmonious composition despite the contrast between hard and soft materials, the different colors, and the different kind of textures that we're seeing in this composition. Now that we've done a deep dive into our elements and principles, we're going to use the knowledge that we learned in this lecture to complete our first exercise, which is going to be our visual analysis.